get started here. I suspect there may be some people who choose to join us, and we will just bear with them as they come in here. So first of all, let me start by saying I'm Bill Potter. I know many, but not all of you. I've had the privilege to be the founding director of CNS and have been with the Institute and the Center since 1989. And I've had the opportunity literally to introduce hundreds and hundreds of very distinguished guests, but there's no one about whom I'm more excited than our speaker today. But before I introduce him, I want to kind of set the stage for the seminar. So I brought kind of two props here, one of which some of you probably have seen before, the other perhaps not. So the first are 4 stones from the Trinity site, ground zero, of the first nuclear explosion in Alamogordo, New Mexico, July 16th, 1945. So, I mean, I'm sure Sig has a collection of these in his backyard, but nonetheless, this is one.
Not in my pocket.
But the second one is a little bit more unusual. These used to be blue flowers that I plucked literally from the epicenter of the first Soviet nuclear test, quite some period after the test in 1949. I picked these flowers in 1997, and I picked them because I was going from the Kazakh facility, the test site, the Polygon in Semipalatinsk, to the first meeting of the negotiation of the Central Asian Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone, in which I was involved. And that blue flower at the time I saw as a symbol of hope, that even if one were to go from the nuclear test site to this conference, flowers were blooming, and it showed to me the potential for what might be done. And in fact, now there is a nuclear weapons-free zone in place in Central Asia. So where did my other prop go? It's going around the room. Okay, there were 4 stones there, by the way.
Should we pass them around, or do you want?
Why don't we leave this one here? I may just crash here. So, in any case, that's the kind of the backdrop. So let me turn now to our speaker, whom I think all of you are well aware is the grandson of Robert Oppenheimer, the leader of the Oppenheimer Project, which is committed to honoring the legacy of J. Robert Oppenheimer and advancing a safer future in the face of technological change. I'm sure our speaker will say more about that in the future. Charles began his career in software as an employee, an entrepreneur, served as an investor, and as one might have anticipated, is in great demand these days as an interviewee and a commentator following the release of this extraordinary film by Christopher Nolan, which I think most people who have seen it found to be exceptionally powerful. And we'll be talking about the film and how it depicts the grandfather of Charles. We are privileged to have a number of authorities on both Robert Oppenheimer and Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I'm not going to mention all of them, but I think one deserves special mention. We have Professor Siegfried, one of our own distinguished professor of practice, and Sig will have an opportunity to weigh in the conversation during the course of our discussion. What I would like to do during the hour and a half or so that we have available to us is, first of all, call upon Charles to make some opening remarks. I'll then ask him some questions. We'll have a conversation. I'll then turn to several other experts in the room for their comments and questions. So that's what I hope to accomplish. We have a substantial online audience, but the discussion here is going to be really confined to the people in this room. That's the plan here. So I think without saying more by way of an introduction, and I'm still trying to see where my 4 stones are. They're still circulating here. Okay.
And there's still 4.
There's still 4. That's great. Charles, it's really a pleasure to welcome you to Monterey, and we look forward to your opening remarks here.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill and Sig, for inviting me. I know Sig from New Mexico, meeting him in Los Alamos, the leader of the lab. My intention for coming to speak is I like to say yes when asked to do things, and I'm very much interested in the subject of this institute. I don't consider myself the expert on non-proliferation studies. I think, you know, I think it's a group effort. And I get asked a lot about the movie these days, so I want to start with that. Let's start with some entertaining items. So people ask me, you know, you're in the family, so do you have control of the movie, and do you get money from the movie, and do you get to meet the movie stars? Those are the important questions. I will say that in the Oppenheimer family, we have kind of a tradition of not leaning into the publicity around it. You know, my grandfather did it as his job. He was quite a famous person and was comfortable with it. My father is not comfortable with public attention or fame, and I was really brought up in a model of not putting yourself out there and saying, I'm an Oppenheimer, listen to me. But as this movie was coming out, I recognized that there would be more public attention on the name in the family than any time since the 1950s. There's also a tradition in the family of, you know, I was told if you can do something with your last name to address in particular the problem of nuclear weapons, you should do that. My dad would kind of sit there, my father, Peter, who's Robert Oppenheimer's son, would say, I can't really do that well, but if you can do it, you can do it. So when I saw the movie coming out, I thought that, you know, this would be a good time to speak up for the family and have kind of a family perspective portrayed too, instead of just the author's version, the historian's version, the movie version. Is there something that we can portray in the family? And I'd actually started a family foundation about 5 years ago, when the Oppenheimer Science and Leadership Program had started in the DOE, and they had asked our permission to give the name. And my father, Peter, said, no, they make nuclear weapons. You know, and that is very, he's unambiguously a pacifist. He believes that if we could just tell people how bad nuclear weapons are, then we wouldn't have them. And he just has, you know, just totally straightforward attitude. I come from the business world. I remember one time talking to Sig and saying, well, I want to start a family foundation and get rid of nukes. And Sig said, these people are not going to give them up. And that really, that affected me. Like, you know, there's a reality of the world where there's a bunch of weapons pointing at each other. And so I say that to say that I was inspired in talking to the DOE. I didn't just say no. I said, well, what do you guys want to talk about? Who are you? You know, let's have a conversation. And I met several people from the DOE, including Lynn Orr, and they described their program that is for promoting scientific leadership. And I ultimately said, well, we're not going to give you permission, but we're definitely not going to sue you if you do something. And that was enough for them to create the program. And I've been friends with Lynn Orr since then. And I started that conversation spawned, why don't we have our own family vehicle and, you know, some version of a thing that can institute, you know, follow the family values besides all these other, how long should I go on here, Bill?
So we have another hour and 20 minutes. So I mean, your opening could be a little bit shorter than that. We're not on a tight schedule.
Okay. So yeah, I was rounding, you know, going back to starting the Oppenheimer Project, and as the movie started, I reached out to Christopher Nolan and asked him, you know, can I give you advice or be involved in the movie? We had a really long conversation in which he basically said, nope, I don't want your feedback. It was a little more diplomatic than that, but he explained some, you know, some reality in Hollywood, which I'm now familiar with. He said, you know, when you're writing a movie, I'm only taking material from American Prometheus, because if I don't, people will come after me and start lawsuits. I said, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. And then later I was approached by different firms who said, hey, are you suing Universal? Because we can go get money out of them. So that's a thing that happens that I didn't know about. I would have liked to have some influence, but after that conversation, they invited, more precisely, I invited myself on the set. They entertained me. They're very nice. Emma Thomas, Nolan's wife, is really a lovely person. And so they would kind of entertain me coming on, but I think in their perspective, especially Nolan, who is an artist and he was a really intelligent guy, very much impressed me with his scholarship on the subject. He had an opinion of what he wants to put in, and he didn't need family members weighing in saying, I don't like that, I don't want that. He didn't want it and he didn't need it. And so therefore, I think they could have used it a little bit. Slightly anecdote from the movie set is I was there in New Mexico and I walked down and I met Cillian Murphy and he looked at me and said, this is weird. So I think he was a little starstruck for 1 minute. But in that scene, that filming that day, he was doing a line and he goes into the office and he says, Nichols, don't be an asshole. Was his line, and they do it over and over and over. And so I went down to Santa Fe and told my dad that, and he was horrified. He was like, Robert Oppenheimer would never swear, like never, and certainly not in a professional situation. And those are the type of things, I didn't know that, I didn't grow up around them, but that there's like these details and parts of personality that you can't get through history books, and that, potentially they could have been well served with. But independent of little quibbles like that, and I was kind of scared when they started the movie, like, are they gonna have this like completely swaggering, swearing guy? But I think that Nolan and the historical artistic version, they did a good job in the movie, and I was prepared to hate it and talk about how much I disliked it and disapproved of it, but I generally liked it even as a family member in their storytelling. And I thought that there was a big anti-war component. The last scene in the movie where the thermonuclear worldwide explosion is going off, I found so horrifying and moving even after the second time, that, like, to me, that's the biggest message that's coming out of it. So yeah, no real influence, no royalties. They go to the family. Only a few movie stars here and there, like Cillian Murphy. Robert Downey Jr. hugged my daughter Lucy. And now I'm working on the Oppenheimer Project, which I've been doing stuff like this, showing up to speak. I'm very interested in the Japan Prime Minister's call for a renewed non-proliferation. That was just last week. And when I looked up that treaty, I think it might be called the FMCT or something, about controlling fissional materials, which is the same proposal of the Acheson-Lilienthal proposal in 1945 to 47. And I get asked that all the time, what do you think is the most significant part of the movie? And I say, well, I don't think it's really in the movie. I think it's what my grandfather advocated from 1945 to 47, and how the Acheson-Lilienthal proposal almost went through, and Truman could have agreed with him. And I feel like it got sabotaged by Baruch intentionally to make the Russians look like they wouldn't accept it. And there was a period in the world where we could have avoided the arms race. I don't believe we could have avoided fission and nuclear weapons generally, but there was a period where I'd like to revise things and say that we shouldn't have an arms race. And for me, that's still the most important thing. And that's a pretty long intro, Bill.
No, that's very, very concise, Charles, given all the things that you might have said, will give you an opportunity. And I think maybe later in the discussion, when we open it up for other individuals, we have a number of diplomats from different countries around the table here. And so we may want to go back and take a look at the Baruch plan and kind of examine may or may not have been possible at that point in time. The one thing I recently heard a video cast with Kai Bird, and so you shouldn't feel bad. He was not consulted either before the script was written.
That's
I mean, he indicated that he got a call, I think, from Nolan to kind of talk about the movie, but he had a script that was prepared before he spoke to anybody else.
That's right.
And so
That's right. Yeah, actually, me and Kai talked about that, and he said, "Yeah, it's kind of a weird feeling. I don't have any control over it." And I was like, "Welcome to the Oppenheimer family."
So one thing that was noticeably absent from the movie, I think for understandable reasons, given the length and the complexity of the film in the first place, was kind of background about Robert when he was growing up. Some of the formative experiences that impacted on his subsequent career. And the thing that I thought was most interesting, which is described in some detail in the Bird and Sherwin book, was his schooling from ages of 7 to 17 at this very unusual Ethical Culture Society School, I think, which is now known as the Fieldston School. And so I'm kind of curious that from your vantage point, in whatever family lore there was, about the impact of that kind of schooling on his subsequent career. Because I mean, according to Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, I have no reason to doubt this, although I didn't go back and double check. The school's motto was deed, not creed, and there was a commitment to kind of practical social action. Is that something that people were familiar with in your I mean, were you familiar with that as you were growing up at all?
Well, so it's interesting. One thing that I view as most formative in his upbringing was his kind of natural curiosity that was then encouraged by his parents. And the Ethical Cultural School was very much in line with that, where he got into science because he started picking up rocks in Europe, and his grandfather gave him a rock collection box, and he was just like, where do these rocks come from? It was that simple, that level of curiosity. And in the Ethical Cultural School, they did have this large influence on both allowing a kid, a weird, quirky kid, to follow all kinds of things that he was interested in, but also the support for this ethical cultural philosophy. He has some quotes about it later in his life. I don't know if Gregg knows this or something. There's some real Oppenheimer wonks who know like every word that he ever said, and I don't know all of them, but he made some disparaging comments about ethical cultural education later in his life. And I don't know if that was his only feelings or something that made it out into the press saying that I don't care about that stuff. But I would say that his actions has demonstrated what he said he cared about when leading the lab wasn't making the biggest weapons as fast as possible and killing a bunch of, he said, what is the effect on humanity? So I draw a line between an education that was really grounded in that. How do you affect the world? Coming from a secular tradition, because the Oppenheimer family had gone secular out of Judaism in the 1880s in Germany. And so there was a whole movement in New York at that time thinking about, well, we're not following a religion, but we care about what's happening in the world. And he came from that movement in an amazing period of education. I honestly don't know what was going on at that point in the world that allowed people to be truly educated. I feel that when I look at my grandfather's academic career, he pursued things for the value of education. He was not doing it for a grade. He wasn't doing it for any other reason. There was this whole infrastructure that allowed him to just really follow his interest. And that is an amazing system that if you go to the field school today, I think they probably have a great school, but I don't know if it has that quality that ended up resulting in, the kind of physics and quantum theory explosion we had in the 1920s and 30s. There was a special time where maybe we had enough development in society, but didn't get to TV and social media or something. I don't know what it was. So anyway, I certainly respect the education he got. It was nothing like mine. I went to Pecos Elementary for 1 year and had to fight it out. There's different ways to get educated, but I think it's really good for certain kids who are really like that, to be like placed in a situation that can really pursue their interests, overlaid with a version of, ethical cultural education.
It's interesting this is kind of an aside, but if you go to the site, to the school's site, they list a number of their most distinguished alumni. And for this audience, somebody that I didn't expect to pop up on the screen was our recent friend who passed away, Bob Jervis, who also a major, for those of you who are not in the international relations kind of school, a major figure in the field who also happened to attend the same.
Well, I'm curious, what do they say, I haven't visited the school, what do they say about their current version of education? Do they focus on something that's similar to that ethical cultural movement?
I think they do. They've expanded, and I didn't explore everything on the site,
Sure.
but then I looked at other articles about them, and they've had their own problems adjusting to the contemporary situation, but they've expanded very significantly. They have a much larger campus now.
It was a real movement around that time, the turn of the century, where there was secular Jewish people who were interested in having an effect on the world, but not just directly derived from these religious principles. And I don't think that it's portrayed exactly the same way, but that's what he experienced.
Another person in the news, Maggie Haberman, I know, who's written a lot about the current political situation, also is identified as an alumna, but that may be getting too far afield. One of the characteristics that I thought was particularly fascinating about your grandfather's outlook was his deep interest in other cultures, in languages and philosophies and literature, something that, in a sense, the hallmark of what we do at the Middlebury Institute. I think certainly that must have impacted significantly on the work that he also pursued. But it was interesting, as I was kind of reading in advance of our seminar today, I came across a reference by Richard Rhodes, another very distinguished historian of the period, who cited your grandfather's close confidant, Isidore Rabi, who observed, and I think I'm quoting this correctly, that he says Robert was overeducated in those fields which lie beyond or outside the scientific tradition, such as his interest in religion, in the Hindu religion in particular, which resulted in a feeling for the mystery of the universe that surrounded him almost like a fog. And he goes on to quote Rabi to the effect that he was married, and I'm quoting here, he married the hard, crude methods of theoretical physics in the mystical realm of broad intuition. The result was a spiritual quality to his speech and manner in which he never expressed himself completely. He always left a feeling that there were depths of sensibility and insight not yet revealed. And so I'm kind of curious, in the family, whether there was this sense of your grandfather and this the notion that he had a kind of mystical outlook, that there was some kind of mystery associated with him. Is Robbie's kind of characterization one that the family, as you know it, shared?
Well, certainly wasn't spoken about in those terms, right? Like that was grandpa, and I didn't meet him, and my dad doesn't necessarily speak about things in those lights. My dad would say, he's a few words, but he said that Robert Oppenheimer was a very special person, and sometimes when we talked about, he can't stand any of this public attention on him. He won't watch the movie and he thinks it's stupid, but what he has said sometimes is that he thinks he was actually more of a special person than all this attention, but the portrayals of him are not actually accurate in terms of what kind of person he was. So that's a small version of it. I might have my own perspective on that, because I really do think that in this very slim historical record, that Robert Oppenheimer very clearly had mystical experiences that he talked about, and that it fundamentally changed his life. And somehow it bizarrely got choreographed into this poison apple incident. But he said on in Corsica that he found the nature of love. And if you look up mystical experiences, they happen very regularly, like 25 to 50% of people. And he said he had one when he was having this big, deep academic crisis. And then he spoke about it at least one other time in his life that made it into a book where he said he had kind of transcended this self-hatred and realized other people didn't dislike him as much as he disliked himself. And so going through, you know, a standard mystical experience that clearly affected the rest of his academic and leadership career, I think is an important way to understand him. And if Robbie says he didn't like it, well, you know, I don't care what Robbie has to say.
He didn't like it.
He said it was, yeah.
He thought that perhaps he
wasn't clear enough.
Bounds.
Yeah, I mean, like, there was scientists like Dirac who was like, why would you ever do that? Why would you not just study science? I would say Robert Oppenheimer, with his mystical and his kind of like loose interpretation of things, was probably more effective than your average left brain scientist, you know, like you know, but I think that was absolutely part of this character.
You want to, I mean, I wasn't sure if I was going to raise this, but since you made reference to the poison apple, do you want to say a little bit about that and how you, I mean, this wasn't Nolan's creation, maybe, I mean, certainly Bird and Sherman talk about it as well. Would you like to comment on it? Is everybody aware of what we're talking about? I mean, okay, so there is
I think the book is more vague about it than the movie.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, why do we,
yeah.
do you want to?
You can
okay,
summarize
so,
the supposed facts.
During his study at Cambridge, there is an episode in which the young Robert Oppenheimer uses cyanide and injects it in an apple for his professor, and then has second thoughts and prevents the professor from actually eating the apple. So
Niels Bohr in that version almost eats it.
Yeah.
that's right, Niels Bohr, yeah. So that's the controversy, and there are, you know, different historians have different takes on what the record shows and how much to be inferred. I mean, there's an interesting review that some of you may have read by Alex Wellerstein, which says, with respect not just to this scene, but many others in the movie, that while they may not have been factually precise, that they were important in kind of telling the story. But I'm curious about your take, Charles, on this particular episode.
Yeah. So I unfortunately find myself talking about this episode like in the media, and then it got like picked up and broadcast everywhere, which is kind of embarrassing. But this is my interpretation of it, and the family's interpretation. The movie I didn't care about too much, because when I talked to Nolan, he said, I'm going to change the story and I'm going to fictionalize things and I'm going to dramatize things. And I found that pretty easy to accept. I'm like, okay, it's a movie, you're going to change stuff. So I didn't expect the movie, but historians, I hold to a much higher standard. And when I read The American Prometheus, and I've talked to Kai Bird about this, they say, we don't know what happened. And if you read the historical record, it says, we don't know what happened. Like, that's the only possible interpretation of the things that they have in the book. So there's no record of, this is what my dad said about it. Trying to kill your professor is a pretty big deal. And it was in 1920, you know, that's a big deal. Like that's not a minor thing. And there's never any record of Robert Oppenheimer. He had unbelievably powerful enemies that's combed through every part of his life. So the fact is this is something that didn't exist in his life. Nobody had ever heard about it. There was no record. There was no administration. While he was living, it didn't exist. So as a historian, can you create something in 2004 that you suddenly say existed and was really important? And if you read painfully enough the interpretation of the sources of this, which are Ferguson and then his two buddies from Corsica, those are the only sources of this story. It wasn't from Cambridge, it wasn't from Robert Oppenheimer. And the two sources of this story, in the breath that they breathed this into the world, they said, I don't know what he was talking about. I think he made it up. That's the only record of this story. And somehow Bird summarize this. Actually, I haven't asked Bert if it was him, but I blame him instead of Sherwin, saying Robert Oppenheimer tried to kill his teacher. And then he has 4 or 5 pages of footnotes that basically say, well, we don't really know what happened, you know, and I really don't like that paragraph. Yeah.
Several of us tried to talk Kai out of that. The poison apple was a metaphor,
Right.
but not an actual.
That's what his friends said. They said, I think he was talking about a metaphor. I don't know what he was talking about. That is the only record of this story.
But Kai went ahead with it. And
I mean, you could put it in the book and say that his friend said that he didn't know what he was talking about on a spring break trip. That would be an accurate portrayal, like when he was having a hard time mentally. But to summarize it, saying he tried to kill his teacher and then back out in 5 or 6 pages of footnotes where they say in their footnotes, in the very last footnote, well, we don't really know what happened. And it got picked up by Malcolm Gladwell, and he put it in his book of only one important fact of Robert Oppenheimer, that he was an attempted killer who got away with it because it's powerful. And I will say that because the family doesn't pay a lot of attention to these things, when it came out in the book, I didn't really care. When it went in Gladwell's book, I didn't really care. We don't public comment on it. And now that I've become a little more mature in my stuff, if this happened again, I would go out there and publicly oppose that from the beginning. You know, that's not what we did in our thing. So it bothers me that enters a historical record, and then there's unending sources of it. People say, oh, it actually happened, it's in the book. Well, that book doesn't actually say that it happened. It said that this guy said that he thought he made it up, is what it says, you know. So it's kind of an unfortunate amount of breath I just spent on it, but it still bothers me. You know, it's like people would talk about your family and they're gonna have different opinions, but at a certain point, it's like they're talking about your mom and you're like, don't do that. I don't, it's like fighting words.
So let's move from the bad apple to another kind of issue here. And here, I'm gonna make reference to Sig as well. I mean, both of us over the years, and we have a lot of years between us, have given so many hundreds, thousands of lectures dealing with different aspects of, in Sig's case, nuclear science, in my case, more nuclear arms control. And if you were to combine all of the members of the different audiences, we may have reached tens of thousands of people. But that pales in comparison to what Chris Nolan's film has done. And I think it has created an opportunity for those of us in this business as professors and others who are influencers to talk about subjects that have been dear to us in a fashion that we have been able to do with many people. And so I'm kind of curious, kind of building upon this, how, you know, what the Oppenheimer Project seeks to do, how you think we may, in fact, leverage this movie to reach a larger audience and to try to get them to think critically about issues which are of such great importance. So if you might want to comment on that, Charles, I would really welcome.
Well, one thing I've noticed is it does really feel like a movement around this movie. It's not just the people in this room who study non-proliferation who say this is relevant to me. It's, you know, the whole Department of Energy and tons of nonprofit, tons of science organizations, museums. A lot of people are saying, and then, you know, half of Silicon Valley saying, well, what is the AI relevance to this story? And I'm, you know, maybe I feel it a little more because people are talking about Oppenheimer stuff, but it does feel like it's opened up this discussion of what went on in World War II, and are we gonna live or die by these creations, and that there is a moment to kind of discuss and use the backdrop and the excitement around the movie to promote it. And that really is the theory of the Oppenheimer Project. Like, if we can do anything to promote the conversation, I don't know exactly how to do that. I mentioned that the head of state calling for of Japan calling for a renewed non-proliferation talks, which I don't think Japan has ever done. Is that right? Or
well,
at least on the presidential, right?
We have ongoing deliberations dealing with the non-proliferation treaty. And I just came from meetings in Vienna last month, and the Japanese were active participants. Unfortunately, the main dedicated forum for nuclear negotiations at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva has just been stuck since 1996. And so it's a nice place to go if you're a disarmament ambassador and don't want to do anything, but it's been stalled there. And then we look at the United Nations, the First Committee, and the General Assembly, and their talks. It's a question of is there any significant movement? And so I think the situation is very, very grim. And one of the things I'm anxious when we turn to the audience, we do have a number of practicing diplomats, and they may wish to comment. Just one observation based upon your question. I mean, while I was in Vienna, it was the first time I went to see the movie. It had just come out maybe a week earlier, and I came away, and then I went from that film to the negotiations on it was the working group on the further strengthening of the NPT review process, and I thought that actually was somewhat stimulating. The next meeting on the preparatory committee was so discouraging. I thought we should really, have these diplomats watch this film and then come back, and then maybe there would be some more meaningful conversation.
Well, that's one of my questions is being from outside of the field. I'm not a diplomat. I've never been to a UN meeting. Is there room for a non-government organization to stimulate the discussion and get people interested? And I think that there is a little bit, if it takes Hollywood and a little bit of this, like I want to see if that helps. One of the only kind of more tactical things I planned out in the project is a 2024 convening on April 22nd, which is Earth Day and my grandfather's birthday. And if we could start orienting around, I think there's circumstances where you could get people showing up to an Oppenheimer convening that they wouldn't to a Biden convening or a Putin convening. And if we have to use the name or Hollywood interest, I think, and Japan would be a perfect place for it. Could we invite somebody from US, Russia, and China to Japan? Like that would be the most interesting thing. And I'll invite the movie stars if I have to. They might say yes, they might say no. You can at least get a hold of them.
Well, this time we will talk more about this. I mean, I want to think that there's a space for us, or I wasted my career and the center. But we definitely believe. We don't promise that we're going to change the world, but we are committed.
You have to have some hope
to working with young people who become diplomats. We have some young diplomats with us here who believe that this is possible. So I want to return.
The only other thing I'd bring up about the Oppenheimer Project is I have become a proponent of nuclear energy and energy expansion. And I want to hear from this room, when I grew up, I had a vaguely negative feeling about it, probably like most people, very much anti-weapons. And is there a position to say we're pro-nuclear energy and energy expansion and anti-weapons expansion? And I think it comes from the same place, which it's not really a technical question for dealing with all these issues. What my grandfather said is it's a human relations problem. And if we're going to decide to get along well enough to not point weapons at each other, that same process of controlling fissionable material would be the same one we would use to decide to make energy. And I don't see them lately as exclusive, although there are some technical questions, of course, but it's mainly the levels of cooperation we could have to have less weapons and more energy, essentially.
We may turn to that, but I don't want us to get too sidetracked that, because I know I give the floor to Sig on that topic that will overshadow everything else that we're talking about here. But I do want to call upon Dr. Hecker at this moment, because as a former director of Los Alamos, he has that in common, with your grandfather. And he also chairs a board at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, where there are only, I think, two such chairs. One was Dr. Oppenheimer, other was Dr. Hecker here. So there is that connectivity. But I think, Sig, it would be really interesting if you could say a bit from your vantage point, having spent such a long time at Los Alamos, not only as the director, but also as I think a postdoc, a staffer, and somebody who remains kind of closely tied to the lab, about the impact of Robert Oppenheimer on the laboratory over the years. And also, if you want to, in your response, say a little bit about the role of the scientists that you know and knew, perhaps not even just in the United States, in terms of their impact, not only on nuclear weapons decisions, but also efforts to try to control nuclear weapons and to foster disarmament. I think it'd really be interesting to get your take on that topic.
Well, thank you, Bill, and Charles, welcome to Monterey. It was nice of you to accept, and I enjoyed your comments. I mean, in a way, I felt a little bit like your family in terms of not wanting to take advantage of the Oppenheimer name. So people say, well, you were there in Oppenheimer's job, and I try to remind people, look, I may have walked in his footsteps, but I could never fill his shoes. It's just a totally different world. I started as director in 1986, although I came to Los Alamos for the first time as a summer student in '65. Okay, so a long time ago. So that was only 20 years after the Manhattan Project. And sort of the spirit of Oppenheimer was still very, very much alive at that time. And I'll come back to the fact, I'll say a little bit more about the influence of Oppenheimer on the laboratory and the laboratory system as such. But at any rate, a couple of things that immediately come to mind based on your comment. The answer to the question that you posed at the end is yes. Can we have nuclear energy, but not have an increase in nuclear weapons? The answer is yes, and I'm also a very strong proponent of that. To me, the whole nuclear world sort of inherited that, from the beginning, was the Manhattan Project, is that when you get a factor of millions in energy, by the fact that you split the nucleus or you fuse nuclei, that is so immense that it has lots of potential good. But because you're talking about a factor of millions, it can also do a lot of potential bad. And so to me, the whole game, that's what I've been trying to do, at least for the last 30 years, is how do you get the best out of the atom and avoid the worst? And so that's sort of the dedication, and I think is what's really important. But the sort of question that I'm asked, like you were asked about the family, I'm asked, from a Los Alamos perspective and a scientist perspective. So was the movie accurate? That's the question I always ask. And my answer to that is, it was good enough. It depends things, sort of the artistic license that he took. Probably the biggest artistic license, and I didn't have to face that one, was the Apple. And the other ones, where he had him going to Einstein to ask him. Well, it wasn't Einstein that he went to.
I kind of like that one. I knew it was fiction, but I thought it worked for the story.
So that's okay. I mean, Einstein is this guy, great white hair, and the public recognizes him. They wouldn't have recognized Arthur Holly Compton, and so. And then the rest of the things, here and there, it's not exactly accurate, but did it get the overall message across? The answer is yes. On the scientific things, I must say, my specialty is such, if I have one, scientific specialty is plutonium. And the technical part that Nolan really brings out in the movie is the issue with the explosive lenses. Once they found out that plutonium doesn't work in this simple gun type assembly, that you'd have to figure out how to assemble it much, much faster. And they, of course, they had the world's brains there, Johnny von Neumann and all these other guys. And so they figured out, okay, you put explosives around that plutonium core and you've got to blow it in real fast. So they played that story up really great, and it was just great. But it turns out there was a story that was even better than the explosive lens, and it was the plutonium. And the story of the plutonium, of how things came together and what they were able to do in the last 9 months. And then particularly, it wasn't until the last few weeks that they actually decided what they had to put into the plutonium in order to make it behave so that they could make this, sphere. So that would have been a great story. So if I would have been his advisor, I would have said, look, Mr. Nolan, it's the plutonium, that really matters. But anyway, and then the last comment, I'll just make it very brief, but I'll be happy to elaborate. So you and your family, obviously have the legacy. I felt part of that family at the laboratory. The Los Alamos Laboratory is J. Robert Oppenheimer's legacy in his laboratory. And it's still that way today. And just all the way through the history of this laboratory. I remember when I was director, and whenever some scientists were upset about we were not doing enough science, too much bureaucracy, they would come and say, are we still Oppenheimer's laboratory? And I said, yeah, we're still Oppenheimer's laboratory. We believe in this, as you had indicated, sort of the interest, the curiosity, the scientific freedom, to go explore things. And what's so interesting is only touched on it in the movie. The reason for that is because J. Robert Oppenheimer's colleagues, Robert Bacher and Isidore Rabi, said, we're not going to wear these army uniforms. And they then managed to get the University of California to run this place at Los Alamos. And that history, that lasted until 2005. University of California ran. It's why I came to the laboratory. I didn't want to go build bombs. That's not what I wanted to do in life. I came there because this was one of the finest laboratories in the whole wide world. It was J. Robert Oppenheimer's laboratory. And so that there, it filters all the way through the history of the laboratory. The University of California and that university management. And I've written papers on this subject as to how incredible innovative it was. And it goes right back to Groves and Oppenheimer and Rabi and company, back in that 1943 timeframe. So that part is really important. And then Ian mentioned another really fascinating subject. And I've actually given lectures on this because I found myself asking that question. I said, if people are watching this movie, and in fact, it was through an email conversation with Governor Cohen also. What about the other Oppenheimers around the world? Were there other Oppenheimers? So what did the Soviets do, for example? Well, it turns out that's a talk in itself. That is really fascinating. They had their own Oppenheimer. And then you look at the history of those in their laboratories, and they wound up having 2 laboratories. In the US, we had 2 weapons design laboratories. So Los Alamos, that was Oppenheimer's laboratory. And then there was the other laboratory I like to call Lawrence Livermore. And that was Teller's laboratory. And these 2 laboratories have had very different cultures. And not that one's bad and one's good, or one's good and one's better. They're different. It's just different. And the one at Los Alamos goes back to your grandfather, and we thank him for that essentially every day. Thank you.
Thanks, Sig. We'll follow up on that in a moment, but I do think it's important to address an issue that probably has been the focal point of more criticism with respect to the film than any other. And that had to do with the lack of direct attention to the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I know that Masako has actually, written about that, for the bulletin. And so I just want to, Masako, give you an opportunity if you want to. I don't suggest you're speaking for anyone other than yourself, but I think it's useful to at least have this, view on the table, and others may want to come in later as well. So I'll give you the floor here.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and Charles, thank you so much for your speech, and I'm so glad that I listened to you directly. And actually, a few weeks before the movie was released, I was contacted by Bulletin to write something about Oppenheimer from Japanese perspective, and they really didn't have any record of what the general Japanese public think about Robert Oppenheimer. Then, to be very honest, I'm not a historian, and I'm a very strong disarmament advocate, but I really didn't know, and I did some research, but I couldn't find it. So what I decided to do is I have a lot of atomic bombing survivors who are my friends. So I contacted a couple of people, and I just candidly asked, so what do you think about Oppenheimer? And both of them had no bad feeling towards Oppenheimer project. All they really hate is the nuclear weapons and the war. So that really kind of reminded me the atomic bombing survivors, deep thinking. It's not just one individual, it's just war itself. Then I watched, but actually I decided to not to write Japanese perspective towards Oppenheimer because I'm not authority. So I decided to write more atomic bombing survivors and the importance of youth education because that's my true passion resides. Future generation is the one who are going to show the planet. So then I also had opportunity to read your message you sent to the conference that was held on July 16th in Santa Fe, organized by Santa Fe Archdiocese and some other non-governmental organization. And I was so inspired. To be very, very honest with you, I had a very mixed feeling after I watched the movie. I even cried because I know a lot of atomic bombing survivors. But when I read your message, may I quote what you said to the message? Then your grandfather's strong emphasis and on the global unity. That really touched. So I just wanted to read that portion because I thought it's extremely important. The most important part of his legacy is my grandfather's advocacy for global unity and openness to deal with our scientific and technological growth that always outspaces our genuine understanding. And you also quoted his lecture from the Open Mind that was published in 1955. And I was also very touched by this short sentence. In the Open Mind, 1955, it is in our hands to see the hope of the future is not lost. So I'm a very idealistic and very peace-minded person. So I was just so happy to read this. And I also changed my perspective towards Oppenheimer. And as you know, Japan is one of the perhaps the only developing country that the movie was not released yet. But in my opinion, I think it should be released and it should generate more educational conversation. So I just wanted to, I'm very curious because your grandfather has a strong emphasis on global unity when we are extremely lacking right now, and we really need global unity, especially when we want to move forward the world free of nuclear weapons. We need to work harder, we need to engage more young people, and when we say global unity, the only common denominator, perhaps, the humanity. And the humanitarian impact of the use of nuclear weapons. So that's something, that's why I really strongly support the humanitarian initiative for the nuclear disarmament. So I just wanted to, do you have any concrete suggestion how we can really strengthen more global unity? I know it's a very broad question, but if you have any comments on this, I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the comments, and it made me think about what I often, people don't know when they hear about Oppenheimer, what his biggest value was, and it's actually what all of you study. That's what he cared about. Could we not have a world where we blow ourselves up? And when he had the opportunity to give advice to presidents in policy and direct advice, what I thought he did well is it wasn't just let's all get along, which I think he really believes deep down that's what his values were, that people could work together and there wasn't a necessity that we had to be in a war and conflict time. But I think they saw, Niels Bohr and him in particular, that they, you know, in the growth of this type of science, we had gotten to a new reality. Like, in fact, we are all connected in this like global tribe, where before it made a lot more sense to get together with your tribe, attack the other one, kill them, take their stuff, and your group works. It does better. And he saw in 1945 that ended, and it was a fundamental change. And so when he was giving advice and policy advice to Truman and the Acheson-Lilienthal plan, it wasn't just, you know, we should do this because it's a really nice thing to do. It was a very practical way to get along with other countries, that we can control this fissile material, and if one group gets out of line, we will attack them if we have to. So it was a combination of doing your duty in war and being able to address other groups. And I think I cannot believe in this day and age that Russians are inherently our enemies and that Chinese people are evil. I don't believe it, you know. So I think that they're in the depths of conflict, and no matter how hard it is and how many kind of short-sighted politicians say, well, we can't get along with the Chinese, we need XYZ treaty done, that you can get people together around the table to recognize those kind of shared threats. And I think that there's a new opening to do that. And it probably starts with the most human level thing of coming together in a room, you know. That's my version of it.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's a shame in some ways that it's not Tuesday, because I would have invited you to come to our simulation, but we spent an entire semester negotiating the next non-proliferation treaty preparatory committee, and we have both young diplomats and our students engaged in almost a 3-month simulation, which they play the roles of other countries. And the whole idea is to kind of try to acquire this skill of empathy, seeing with the eyes of others. So that's something that we try to inculcate in our students. But I think I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open up the floor for discussion. And the question, which is directed to you, but I know that Gregg and Sig in particular may wish to comment on it, has to do with one of the I can say two villains, if you like, in the film, and that is Edward Teller. The only person in the film that I had an occasion to interact with in a very indirect fashion over a period of time. And I just remember him with his big staff that he always carried around, at least when I had the chance to see him. But I'm kind of curious in the family lore, how he was depicted. I mean, the film talks about, you know, Kitty's view as opposed to somewhat perhaps more forgiving stance on the part of your grandfather. I know Sig had lots of interactions with him over the years, and Gregg, I read some of your, I don't know if tweets or on Facebook, your interviews with Teller. And so I'd be kind of curious first to hear from you, Charles, and then, you know, Gregg and Sig, if you want to kind of add to our knowledge base or folklore, as the case may be. I appreciate your comments as well. But Charles, why don't you start us off, please?
So yeah, I grew up not hearing anything about Edward Teller, and I asked my dad, you know, was he an enemy of the family? And absolutely not. Like, that's not how Robert Oppenheimer viewed it at all. It was never mentioned in the family. Matter of fact, there's this great story of a graduate student going to I can't remember who it was, Princeton, the Institute of Advanced Study, this was months after the trial. And he was asking for help with its placement, and Robert says, well, I know who to call, called Edward Teller. He answers the phone and he said, how's the family? What's going on? He said, I have a student here who needs help. And this guy was shocked. He was like, I thought you were enemies and stuff. So that's how it was viewed in the family. And it wasn't, the movie probably did a good portrayal of Kitty was much more practical than Robert. He probably was very pissed off at Edward Teller. And, Robert recognized what had happened there, but I think the camaraderie between scientists was there. It did deeply affect Teller's position in the scientific community because it was unambiguous that other people did not like him for his testimony, but it was not what was retained in the family. It was nothing that was ever talked about. And also, I happen to know Teller's grandson, I guess, who runs a division in Google. And I wonder, Robert was very wise about a lot of things. I do wonder about Teller because he was an incredible physicist and he was really smart and he didn't trust the Russians. And there's always two sides of a story. And he thought we should have this big arms race. So far, we haven't blown ourselves up. And because he's a scientist, I don't view him as a fundamentally evil person. He had a different perspective. It did work in the government. And so that's kind of an ambiguous answer, but that's where I go with it. I don't know. What
so why don't I turn, thank you so much, Charles. Gregg Herken, for those who don't know, is a historian who's also written about the relationships, including between Teller and Robert Oppenheimer and the Brotherhood of the bomb. So Gregg, if you want to say a few words based upon your own interactions and knowledge, then I'll turn to Sig, who also has had extended interactions and can present perhaps a different perspective, but I'll give you the floor first.
Yeah, well, actually, I interviewed Teller 4 times, well, actually 3 times, but the 4th time he threw me out of his office. So I guess that doesn't quite.
If you mention the word Oppenheimer, I heard he gets really pissed off.
Well, the last interview was less than 3 months before Teller died. I gave a talk about my book at Livermore. And part of the deal I worked out at the lab was that I would get to see Edward Teller one more time. He'd had a stroke by that time. He was blind, and I was told he had good days and bad days. And luckily, it was a good day. And I went in and I asked him what he thought of the book, and he said he found no major errors. So that is high praise from Edward Teller.
Major.
He had the book read. So, the curious thing about every interview I had with Teller is that Teller he knew I was there to ask about Oppenheimer, but he was always the first person to raise Oppenheimer's name. And this time he said, in effect, so do you think I did the right thing at the hearing in what I said? And I said, well, it wasn't necessary. It was a political trial. The fix was in. You knew the outcome, what the outcome was going to be. You didn't need to say that. And his answer was very typically Teller. I do not think that it may have been unnecessary. A double negative, which he knows. And this is what 60-some years after the event. It is not an apology.
Yeah.
It is he had not changed his point of view. And he went on to say the reason he said the things he did is because Oppenheimer had very effectively opposed the hydrogen bomb.
Right.
And of course, by 1954, by the time of the hearing, the hydrogen bomb was a fact. But I think Teller wanted to make
Which
sure.
has nothing to do with security.
Yeah, well, I think that Teller wanted to make sure that Oppenheimer would not be a voice in Washington. The comment was made that every time he and Strauss opened a door in Washington, Oppenheimer was behind it. That Teller was going to make sure this wasn't the case. So that's why he said the things he did. And he never changed his point of view. When many people who interviewed Teller were kicked out of his office. We had our own little group.
Richard Rhodes talks about that.
Yeah, and in 1993, we were invited, when we all went to the 50th anniversary of Los Alamos, we were invited back, basically, to interview Teller and ask any question we wanted. And So we showed him a document where he had always said, well, he was going to testify for Oppenheimer at the hearing. That was all said. We showed him a document that he had written, the letter 2 days before, to the effect that he had already discussed his testimony with Roger Robb, the prosecutor, and that he was going to take the offense. He was going to be for the prosecution. And I'm the one who handed it. I think Priscilla gave me the letter. We all had it. And I gave it to Teller, and he looked at it. And he looked at the signature and he said, yes, this appears to be my signature. It appears to be my letter. And he handed it back to me and he said, but my memory is. And if you read Teller's memoir, there's a nice footnote at the bottom of the page conveying the fact that I provided this letter. But the story he gives is his memory, that he was going to speak on Oppenheimer's behalf, which is simply historically not true.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the version that I heard was maybe it's typically Oppenheimer view that my grandfather didn't care enough about him to consider him his enemy. He just didn't see things that way. And also he's a forgiving person, but the scientific community did not feel that way. Like he was ostracized and it was unambiguous. So I mean, I guess except for all the people who made money with old Teller, like we had a good business going on.
So you want to share some historical anecdotes, Sig?
Yeah, so I have met Teller over the years, actually. I was telling Bill when he asked me, he says, did you ever meet Teller? I said, yes. So the first time, I was chosen to be the next director of Los Alamos in late 1985. I said, look, give me a little chance. I was there at the laboratory already as a scientist. I'll take over in mid-January. On January 6th, I got a call. I had never met Teller by this time, but I got a call and it says, Siegfried, this is Edward. We must mate. So that was my introduction to Edward. The other thought that I had that I told Bill, he would make almost as interesting a movie as J. Robert Oppenheimer, because you look at the complexity and the contradictions of characters. So Los Alamos hated Edward Teller. He was a hated person at Los Alamos for all the reasons that Gregg just pointed out. And he took the hero of Los Alamos and did what people at Los Alamos thought was just absolutely unconscionable. And even though he tried to walk back from that in his peculiar ways, Los Alamos people never forgave him. And so from whereas Edward was at Los Alamos, although your grandfather very wisely put Edward off to the side, he was a pain in the behind. He was trying, J. Robert Oppenheimer was trying to develop the atomic bomb, and Edward just wanted to do the super. He wanted to take the next step, the fusion. Besides that, he played of people that I know, that they were there. He played the piano at 3 o'clock in the morning in this housing development where he woke people up. And he was just a difficult guy to get along with. But he has so much history, going back to Hungary, his upbringing, and then what a lot of people didn't know, he lost his foot in a tramway accident, cut off his foot at like age 18 or so in Munich, and so he had an artificial limb. But anyway, so in Los Alamos, he was hated because of Robert Oppenheimer and because he founded Livermore as being distinctly, the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, being distinctly in opposition, to Los Alamos. So E.O. Lawrence and Edward Teller set up this separate laboratory because J. Robert Oppenheimer was not enthusiastic enough about the hydrogen bomb and other things. And Los Alamos, we never had any use, so to speak, for Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. We knew that during the Cold War, that the Soviets were our adversaries at Los Alamos. We knew that. But our enemy was Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. and Teller was the founder, and he actually was the second director at Livermore also. So that was one side of Teller. But much like Oppenheimer, he was brilliant. He also never won a Nobel Prize, but he was brilliant. And in the 1930s, I think it was 33 or so, he and one of his colleagues published a paper about something called the Jahn-Teller effect. And it's about the behavior of electrons. And so when I became director at Los Alamos, the big scientific news that year was the discovery of what was called high temperature superconductivity. And that is that, whereas normally when the electrons go through copper, there's a lot of heat created, they lose a lot of capability to go through. But there's the possibility under some circumstances that you can move the electrons through and there's essentially no loss of anything. And there was the discovery, and it turns out Teller's paper from 1933 became crucial in trying to understand this high temperature superconductivity. So I had Edward to come back and give a colloquium, at the laboratory about electrons, not about super bombs. And so I had Edward over at my house. He played the piano for my 7-year-old daughter.
But not at 3 in the morning.
Yeah, we had this baby grand piano. She was taking lessons, and in the morning, I said, Edward, would you mind playing the piano for my daughter? Edward said, yes. I can do this, but you must have this book from Mozart and this book from Beethoven. And I said, oh my God, how am I? It turns out, fortunately, Los Alamos folks helped me. We got these books, and Edward played the piano for my daughter. He had her on his lap. At dinner, he was the quintessential European gentleman. I mean, just charming, incredible. So that was the Edward Teller. I personally really enjoyed talking to Edward, learning from Edward, but I personally could also never forgive him because even though things were decided, but he put the screws in, and that was unforgivable.
I would like to add something. It's interesting, there are certain kind of ironies. I had myself a few exchanges with Teller, letters back and forth about his relationship with Israel, with his friend Yuval Ne'eman, that was also a friend of mine. We had a number of telephone conversations. The big irony is that he really mixed issues of truly security and politics. He did view your grandfather in his mind as not the best serving the interests of the United States, and that's why he said what he said in those hearings in 1954. But from the point of view of security, I think that Robert J. Oppenheimer was very, very careful and did not violate security issues. The great irony is, and I can say, this is a relatively small forum, there is a lot of anecdotes and indications that who did violate issues of security in helping Israel was no other than Edward Teller himself. Edward Teller himself, there are all sorts of stories. And apparently the FBI was told not to look into that, and they did not look into that. And it was, I'm not going to that right now, but he was helping because he thought it's the best interest he can do it. It's a global interest, whatever he thought to himself. So he was quite loose about those issues of security. What I did want to ask you, as maybe not everybody in this room knows, about a year ago, the Department of Energy, in a quite remarkable ceremony, posthumously, they provided back the security clearance to your grandfather. When I read, Kai is a very close friend of mine. I know Kai for many years, we are close friends, and I know that Kai was quite involved in it. But I would like to hear from your perspective, from the family perspective, about the process that led to that, how the family took it. I think it's very moving, emotional moving.
Yeah.
So if you can say a few words about that.
Thanks, Evan.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that perspective on Teller. That's really interesting. In end of 2022, they vacated the decision. They actually did not restore the security clearance, which was the technical mechanism that they got it done. Matter of fact, Granholm's lawyer, Narayan, is this amazing researcher, and he went on this huge delve into the archives, helped by the years of advocacy from Kai Bird and many lab directors and many people, many scientists from the labs who were advocating for this over and over. And the family never was. I was asked to participate in a lawsuit in around 2006, and I said, "Oh, I could never do that. Like, that's not what we do in the Oppenheimer family." Now I would have done it. It took me a while to get up to speed to just jump along. So we hadn't been advocating, but a lot of people had in the scientific community, primarily in the historian community. But with Narayan, the legal process that they used was to rescind it on process instead of the merits of the security trial. And that was the right legal thing to do, because when they looked at the process, it was illegal. And it was a violation of all kinds of rules of internally to the DOE. And they were further able to say that the violations of the process were the AEC in 54, and therefore we don't have to redo and recast everything in today's terms. So that was an important background that I didn't have any familiar with. And then it also needed a leader like Granholm. When Moniz was running it, I don't actually know him personally, but I'm sure some of you people do. The same question went to him, and he checked with some kind of institutionalist lawyers within the DOE, and they said, "No, we can't change our mind on that." And so it took this kind of like legal framework and leadership, but in terms of the impact, it just was really nice. Like, it wasn't, "Oh, you should have done it before." It was really nice to be read that and hear the news for the family. And even my dad, who never says anything very nice, he said, "I'm happy about this." I was like, "I'm shocked. I've never heard you say that once in my life." So it was really nice. I wrote an op-ed, and eventually we published it in a bulletin, thanks to Sig. I published it in a local paper, but that was actually the first public thing I had written about my grandfather, and it was really surprisingly difficult for me. It was very hard to go out there and say, "This is what we think in the family, and this is what the significance is." So encourage you to maybe look it up in the bulletin if you want the longer version, but I think it really is important. And when I went to Los Alamos with Granholm about a month ago, she was saying, "We want to hear from scientists. One of the reasons we did this is we don't want our history to be, when you're a scientist with a political opinion, we prosecute you for political reasons. And that if we don't do that in the community, we think, it's better for us." If that's the precedent that the government sets, it really is an important sea change. And it's an interesting reflection on the philosophy of these two people. You have you have something that happens in science, like you're going to make a bomb and end a war. I can never blame my grandfather or Edward Teller or any soldier who fought in World War II. They were placed in a position, they had to do what they had to do in a war. But how do you manage it? What's your ethical framework? There's people like our entire government and trillions of dollars that said, "Let's make as many bombs and weapons as fast as we can, nonstop," since that period. And that is the philosophy that won out. And there was people like my grandfather and Niels Bohr who said, "We can manage this and go into a method where we don't do that." And that side lost at that period in 1940 till now. Effectively, we're still making bombs. And this could be a time where, that underlying thinking publicly changes.
So what I'm going to do, thank you, Charles. We only have about 15 minutes left, and I want to give our students and young diplomats an opportunity to ask any questions that they may have. And so we'll look particularly favorably upon any questions from those categories of members of our audience here. So I knew Ali would raise his hand. So you want to introduce yourself, but there's time. A brief question would be welcome, and then we'll people select a few and then you can respond.
Sure. Thank you very much for this incisive lecture. I am Ali from the NPTS program. I believe nuclear history is a very fascinating subject, and with eminent historians sitting here. And I think nuclear history we owe our understandings a lot to the new wave of nuclear history that has been in place, especially thanks to the opening up of archives at the Wilson Center and other George Washington University. My question is to you, Mr. Oppenheimer, and all the eminent historians sitting here. How can historians like yourself take advantage of the work or the project that the Oppenheimer family has started in filling up the black holes, if there are any, in nuclear history, so that us students and us scholars can learn more about how the nuclear excursion took place and what you as a family can offer to budding nuclear historians?
Thanks, Ali.
Well, I guess the first question comes to mind, can we learn from history, right? Like why talk about history? I've been moved to say, if we talk about the substance of what happened and what were the decision points that got us into an arms race and how we got here, that there could be some learning from it. I found that my grandfather's words themselves are really powerful. They're kind of hard to read. So that might be the answer to you historians. If you have a lot of time and you have to study something, I'd urge you to study not the historian's takes, not the summary, not the Hollywood movie, but what he actually said in context. And I find that is some of the most powerful treatment of this, because when he was speaking to the scientific leadership in Los Alamos, he said what he meant. And he gave a path for us to avoid an arms race and avoid the whole thing. And I feel like if we could have just listened to what he said, that's my guidepost, because I'm no Robert Oppenheimer, I have to like listen to him. So
Thanks, Ali. We have actually, so Anthony has his hand up. He comes to us from UC Berkeley, where he had a science background. So I'm not sure if you're going to ask a more technical question or not, but you have the floor for a moment, Anthony.
Oh, thank you so much. By the way, it's quite a pleasure, and just thank you so much for coming here. And I feel, when I saw this event, I feel I'm obligated to come, because I just finished actually a summer program in Los Alamos.
Okay.
And so watching like the protective force fighting the bears. So and also enjoy the Oppenheimer Festival there. So one thing that I really want to ask, like Mr. Oppenheimer and also like Dr. Hacker is that throughout my time, like I was working in like non-proliferation, like NN1, like non-proliferation technology and safeguard technology perspective, I understand that there is a major shift that concerns from like a state actor to non-state actors in nowadays like world in like concerning like nuclear proliferations. Meanwhile, there is also like when we increasing our need, like autonomous mobile and like electric cars, that energy that provided by nuclear powers is also like increasing in that such demand. So do you think like in the foreseeable future that nuclear energy will be integrated into a grand kind of strategy of nuclear security, that not only considering like nuclear weaponry, but also considering like a more broader perspective of the general nuclear use?
I'll give a real quick cut and then give it to a professional, so I'm just making this up. One thing I've been promoting is that the idea of common ground is like a better place to get there. If you just directly sit down and say, let's give up our weapons in any context, it's a very hard conversation to have. And I feel that the threat of climate change and the global recognition that we need more energy and that nuclear energy is one of the most common places, I have some hope that the developing consensus around that is actually easier than starting with like, let's get rid of our weapons. So that's a start. I certainly haven't proven that, but like, what do you think, Sig?
Well, as Charles already indicated earlier, in terms of the issue of moving towards disarmament, of just getting rid of nuclear weapons, that's when we first talked, I think, when you were looking at the direction of the foundation, I just said, I just don't see how we can get there for now. And so instead, I sort of dedicate myself to how do we manage the risks? And that isn't going to be by getting rid of nuclear weapons right away. So first of all, then can we move towards nuclear energy and control all these other things? So my view is we must. And I just keep thinking that, sometime, maybe 50 or 100 years from now, hopefully as this earth can survive, its constant heating up, people at that time, they're going to look back and they're going to say, what in the world were these people thinking in 2000, 2010, and 20 and not develop nuclear energy? For heaven's sakes, I mean, we've taken our globe and we've trashed it in every way. Yet, because as what I mentioned before, because of the fact of millions, you have all these potential bad things. And so that's what we have to figure out how to manage. The bad things, of course, are the potential nuclear proliferation potential, the nuclear terrorism potential, is the nuclear waste problem. The question is, what do we do with it? But actually, right now, the biggest challenge is economics.
Yeah,
It's just the economics, and not so much in running the reactors once you have them, but in getting them up. And we've made it almost impossible in this country to build anything big nuclear. And so there, the hope, what most of the technical world points to is small modular reactors or micro, modular reactors to move in that direction. That is some hope, but it's still not going to be that easy to get there. So this problem is going to have to continue to be worked. Certainly, if I were to re-enter, the technical problem, those are the things that I would concentrate on. How do we get the best while avoiding the worst?
Thank you, Sig. I mean, for those of you who are not in the non-proliferation program, and this may not be your focus, it's worthwhile to recall, for those of you who are, that the non-proliferation treaty was a bargain. And there are three pillars that you may be familiar with: disarmament, non-proliferation, peaceful use. What I would like to do, since we've heard from those who are promoting peaceful nuclear use, which is certainly one of the cornerstones of the treaty. We've heard reference to non-proliferation and disarmament. I'd like to call upon one of our young diplomats from a non-nuclear weapons state who might share with us her impressions about both the film, if she has seen it, and the conversation today, because it's one thing for us to talk about this from an American perspective, and I really appreciate Masako's vantage point from a Japanese perspective. But we have a diplomat from Mexico here. Dalia, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm sure you are up to the challenge here. Would you like to say a little bit about perhaps how a practicing Mexican diplomat views the subject matter?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Oppenheimer. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a big honor to be here, to meet you and to hear all these experts. Well, of course, Mexico is a big country in the fight for nuclear disarmament. We want all nuclear weapons to disappear completely. We see it from, of course, a practical perspective. We see it from the security perspective. We see it from the development perspective. And now I have to add from the feminist perspective as well, because we have a feminist foreign policy. First of all, I appreciated the movie. I have some comments, of course, from the feminist perspective. I have some comments from the from certain aspects of the Mexican foreign policy that were not portrayed in the movie. So all in all, I think that the movie probably it was very expensive to make, and it takes very long hours, and still it left me a bit dissatisfied with the huge potential it could have in the general debate. Now I have, and excuse me if I take the hat of a diplomat on the side, because I don't have very often the privilege or the luxury to make a question from my personal interest, because I'm a diplomat. But in this case, I will do it. And this is also for the experts, for Dr. Herken especially. Something that I find fascinating is that the aspect of the ethical concerns of your grandfather and the legacy in the laboratory that implies freedom and curiosity to advance science. And seen also from the human rights perspective, we have a right to get technological advancements and to benefit from those advancements. But I'm wondering, what would be the position or the opinion of your grandfather, or nowadays of your foundation, on this debate that I think is unsettled yet, about having a Hippocratic oath for scientists that work on nuclear matters, which I think is part of the problem nowadays, that we want scientists to advance this knowledge for the benefit of humanity, but sometimes it's completely impossible to avoid that this curiosity gets in hands of people that feel a fascination for weaponry or for the capacity of turning this into an attack. Thank you.
Thank you, Dahlia. Thank one for the perspective, which I think is important for us to hear, and for the difficult question for us to respond to. Charles, I don't know if you want to try your hand at it. I'll give Sig an opportunity, and then we'll probably have to wrap up.
Well, I guess that is the question, and that's what Oppenheimer most symbolizes. He believed and loved science. He said science is something that you have to believe is for the benefit of mankind. You have to do it and turn it over for the lights and benefits of other people. And he stood by that while he watched his government go into an arms race that he thought was avoidable. And so to some extent, I think you have to separate those two things, the act of doing science and then how you use them, how you use that output. And it's not really avoidable. It's not a possibility to say we're not gonna advance technologically or scientifically. So we can dismiss that. Like you can advocate for it. You can say it's what we should do. It will never happen. That's not what the universe is doing right now. It is expressing itself in science and technological growth. And then the ethical and political side is something that people, I believe, has gone largely in the right direction. We've got these terrible weapons pointing at each other and we're not even dead yet. And generally we're all better off than we ever were. And so you just have to have the best hope that you can that as humans we can kind of have our very slow moving organizations catch up with our science and philosophy. But that's my perspective on it.
Thank you so much, Charles. Sig, I'm going to give you an opportunity if you want to respond. We have like a minute left, and so I do want to close in just a moment here. You have a 30-second comment here.
That's very tough, and it almost sounds like an accusation that we're not ethical as such. So even though I've never taken a Hippocratic oath as such, I feel that I've done my scientific job exactly in that way from an ethical standpoint. And so I think that the most important thing would be you should not prevent us from discovering, but you should put limits on how we use.
Thank you, Sig. Let me first say, Charles, it's been really such a pleasure to meet you, to have you join us here. We are really committed to addressing the issues that I understand are central to the Oppenheimer Project. And I hope that we have the opportunity to work together. We have the privilege to work with young people who are much more, I think, idealistic, have more energy, are less cynical than some of the folks around the room here. And that's what keeps me going. And so I want to thank them for joining us. And please ask you to join me in expressing our appreciation to Charles.